The lottery slips were still spread across the counter when Calvin Mercer reached for the last stack. It was a little past midnight on October 12, 1994, and he was deep into another quiet overnight shift. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the small gas station as he marked the totals with steady movements. His routine was simple, and every night followed the same rhythm. He checked the slips, balanced the drawer, and restocked the shelves before the early morning commuters arrived. Calvin carried a box of cigarette cartons from the back room and placed each pack with careful precision. He worked slowly, not because he was tired, but because the silence of the night always made him more focused. The security camera above the counter recorded every motion. Capturing the steady pace of a man who had done this job for years without complaint, he moved next to the pumps, studying the small digital readings on the screen behind the counter. He logged the numbers in a worn notebook and placed it under the register. The wind outside pushed against the glass door, but the station remained empty. It was the kind of night Calvin expected. Nothing unusual. Nothing loud. Nothing dangerous. He wiped the counter with a cloth and stacked a fresh roll of receipt paper beside the register. The clock above the drink cooler showed 12:27 a.m. Calvin glanced at it, then adjusted a few newspapers on the stand near the door. The camera captured each step as he walked in and out of frame, unaware that these were the last clear images that would ever be seen of him alive. Faint chime sounded as the front door opened. Calvin looked up. The footage showed him pause for a moment, as if trying to identify the person who had entered. Only the outline of a figure appeared in the doorway. The lighting outside was too dim to reveal a face, and the angle of the camera showed only the back of Calvin as the person moved further inside. Calvin stepped behind the counter, reaching for something just out of view. His posture shifted from calm to alert. He rested one hand near the register, then lifted it slightly as if he was preparing to speak. The figure moved closer, staying low and close to the aisles. The camera caught only quick movements, a shadow passing between shelves, then disappearing behind the middle row of snacks. Calvin leaned forward, maybe trying to get a better look. His shoulders tensed. He moved one step back, and his hand brushed the roll of receipt paper he had placed on the counter minutes earlier. The small roll tipped and fell, landing near his feet. The sound did not reach the microphone clearly, but the motion was sharp enough to catch attention on the recording. The figure stepped into view for less than a second. A blurred shape, tall enough to block part of the candy shelf behind it, moved toward the counter. Calvin reacted immediately, pulling his hands close to his body. The camera showed him shift to the left, then angle his body toward the doorway, as if he was considering escape or a quick move toward the back room. There was no audio to explain what he heard. No clear image to reveal the stranger's face. The camera captured only the rapid change in Calvin's posture as the figure raised an arm. Something glinted under the harsh indoor light, but the video resolution was too poor to identify what it was. Calvin took one more step back. His foot slipped slightly on the fallen receipt roll and he steadied himself on the edge of the counter. The figure lunged forward, closing the distance between them in one sudden motion. The scene shifted, blurred by movement, and the camera struggled to focus. For a moment, both figures were only shadows locked in the same narrow frame. Then the screen flickered. A vertical line of static cut through the picture. The recording hesitated, froze, and then resumed with a distorted image of the counter and the empty space behind. Calvin was gone. The figure was no longer visible. Only the hum of the lights and the untouched shelves remained. On the silent tape, seconds later, the screen turned black, ending the final known footage before the attacker could be seen clearly. Calvin Mercer lived a life that rarely drew attention. At 44 years old, he worked steady night shifts at a small gas station, choosing the quiet hours because they suited his calm and patient nature. He liked predictable routines, and he preferred the silence of late nights over the noise of daytime traffic. His coworkers described him as dependable, someone who never arrived late and never missed a shift. He lived in a modest rental house a few miles from the station, and most evenings followed the same pattern before he left for work. He prepared simple meals, listened to local radio news, and checked on small tasks around his home. Nothing about his lifestyle stood out. He did not have expensive hobbies or unusual habits. He avoided drama and rarely expressed anger. People in town knew him more by presence than by personality. They saw him behind the counter, counting bills carefully or helping customers without complaint. That was the extent of most interactions. Yet it was enough for many to recognize him as part of their daily routines. Calvin kept a small circle of family. His younger sister Marlene lived in the same county and visited him occasionally. Their bond was steady, shaped by years of relying on each other after their parents passed away. She often worried that Calvin worked too many quiet nights alone, but he always reassured her that the job was safe and predictable. He liked the structure, the sense of order, and the peace that came with an empty store in the early hours of the morning. He did not drink heavily, gamble, or spend time with suspicious groups. His finances were limited but stable. He had no long-standing disputes with coworkers or neighbors. Police would later examine every detail of his history, searching for conflict or hidden problems, but they found none. His life left a clean trail, free of enemies, grudges, or dangerous connections. This quiet existence, so ordinary and undisturbed, created an unsettling question for investigators. A man with no disputes and no known threats should not disappear without a trace. Yet that was exactly what happened, leaving police with no direction and no one to suspect. The lights were still glowing inside the gas station when the first customer of the morning stepped through the door. It was just after 5 a.m., and the quiet building should have held the familiar sound of Calvin Mercer greeting early commuters. Instead, the store felt motionless. The counter stood empty, and the radio behind it played faint static. Nothing suggested a struggle, yet something was clearly wrong. The customer called out for Calvin, but no answer came. The coffee machine was warm, and a stack of newspapers waited to be arranged, exactly as Calvin handled them every morning. His jacket hung on its usual hook, untouched. The open register drawer revealed bills and coins still in place. It looked as if Calvin had stepped away for only a moment. But the silence carried a weight that did not match the scene. A second customer arrived minutes later, noticed the same empty counter, and grew uneasy. Both men stepped outside to check around the building, hoping Calvin might be nearby, but the lot was empty. The pumps were inactive, and the surrounding road remained still in the gray morning light. There was no sign of movement at all. By 5:18 a.m., one of the customers contacted local authorities. Officers arrived quickly, aware that Calvin was rarely careless and never abandoned a shift without explanation. They moved through the store with deliberate steps, scanning every aisle. Nothing was overturned. No shelves were disturbed. The quiet order of the station deepened the strangeness of his disappearance. One officer noticed a small item near the counter. A roll of receipt paper lay on the floor, flattened slightly on one side as if someone had stepped on it. It was out of place in a store where Calvin kept everything precise. Another officer examined the counter surface and found faint smudges near the edge. They resembled fingerprints, but the surface had been wiped recently, making the impressions unclear. The security camera mounted above the counter was still recording, its red light blinking steadily. Officers rewound the tape to review the last moments recorded. The footage showed Calvin working through his normal routine before reacting to something near the entrance. The tape, however, cut out after a brief struggle of shadows. The final frame captured an empty counter, the same emptiness greeting officers now. The cause of the break in the recording remained unknown. Outside, officers expanded their search perimeter. They looked behind the dumpster, around the service road, and toward the grassy edges of the property. The early morning air was cold, and the wind carried no sound except passing traffic far in the distance. A sweep of the immediate area produced nothing, no signs of Calvin, no dropped belongings, and no clear direction of movement. Then an officer kneeling near the far edge of the lot noticed a pattern pressed lightly into the dirt. A single set of shoe prints, angled away from the building, moved toward the darker fields beyond the pavement. The prints did not match any footwear belonging to responding officers, or the two customers who had discovered the empty store. The trail pointed outward, leading into uncertainty. Suggesting that someone had left the scene deliberately and alone, detectives Edward Halle and Maria Linton arrived at the gas station within an hour of the initial call. Stepping into a scene that felt both calm and unnervingly empty, they moved with the experience of investigators who had seen many missing person cases. But even in the first minutes, something about this one felt wrong. The station looked untouched. The shelves were full. The register was open but not disturbed. Calvin's personal items remained exactly where he would have left them during a normal shift. There was no clear sign of a robbery, no sign of escape, and no evidence of a struggle strong enough to break the order of the room. Detective Halle began by reviewing the security footage more thoroughly. The grainy recording captured the final minutes of Calvin's shift with limited clarity. The tape showed him arranging items, writing notes, and reacting to someone entering the building. The figure remained blurry, moving between shelves where the camera angle offered no facial detail. The moment of the blurred struggle passed quickly, followed by the sudden malfunction of the recording. Halle watched the tape multiple times, looking for any overlooked detail, but each replay revealed the same frustrating gaps. Detective Linton focused on witness canvassing. She interviewed the two customers who had found the store empty. Both men described the same quiet scene when they arrived and insisted that the lights had already been on. Neither of them heard anything unusual when they approached the building. No vehicles sped away, no voices echoed from the lot, and no suspicious figures appeared in the area. Their statements matched, leaving little room for speculation. The detectives expanded their questioning outward. Nearby businesses were still closed due to the early hour, but Linton contacted owners and employees throughout the day. A few recalled seeing Calvin during previous shifts, but no one had noticed anything unusual on the night of his disappearance. It was a dead end that offered no progress. Attention then shifted to late-night customers seen in the past week. The detectives tracked down several individuals who regularly stopped for fuel or small purchases. Asking about their movements on the night of October 12th, every person provided straightforward answers. None of them had been at the station during the critical time window. Their alibis matched work schedules, receipts, or family confirmations. One by one, they were dismissed as potential suspects. Another lead pointed toward a group of transient workers passing through town for seasonal labor. Halle and Linton visited the temporary lodging areas where some of them had stayed. A few workers remembered stopping at the gas station earlier in the week, but none claimed to have visited it that night. Their timelines were difficult to verify, but nothing linked them directly to the disappearance. Their lack of connection made it impossible to move forward with them as solid suspects. A more promising angle emerged when an older employee mentioned a former co-worker who had left the job after disagreements with management. This man had argued with Calvin on several occasions about shift coverage and responsibilities. Detectives tracked him down and questioned him thoroughly. He admitted to having conflicts with Calvin in the past, but insisted he had no involvement. His alibi placed him at a family gathering several towns away, confirmed by multiple relatives. His background did not include violent behavior, and he showed no signs of dishonesty during questioning. The lead collapsed, adding another dead end to a growing list. Detectives then shifted their focus to Calvin's last recorded transactions. They reviewed receipts, timestamps, and log entries, hoping a pattern would reveal something important. The sales were ordinary: snacks, fuel, cigarettes, and coffee. No purchase stood out as unusual or linked clearly to the unknown figure in the footage. Each item matched the typical flow of a quiet night shift. Finally, forensic technicians processed the counter area. They lifted several partial prints, but most belonged to regular customers or employees. One smudged print near the register stood out due to its unusual placement and unclear shape. It did not match Calvin, and it did not match anyone who normally visited the store. When detectives ran the print through the local fingerprint database, the result came back empty. The partial fingerprint belonged to someone unknown, offering the first real clue of the investigation, yet leaving detectives with a troubling realization that the Person who touched the counter had no record in any nearby jurisdiction. The news of Calvin Mercer's disappearance spread through the small Illinois town within hours. People who passed the gas station every day struggled to understand how a quiet cashier, known mostly for steady habits and calm conversation, could vanish without a sound. The station reopened under temporary staff, but customers entered with caution, glancing toward the counter where Calvin once stood. The familiar building no longer felt predictable. It carried a sense of unease that settled over the community like a weight. Local residents spoke in short, serious tones about the case. They questioned how such an incident could happen in a place where violent crimes were rare. Parents kept closer watch on their children. Workers avoided late-night stops unless necessary. Neighbors checked their doors twice before turning in for the night. The uncertainty created a silent tension that touched almost every household. People wanted answers, but no one had seen or heard anything that could help. Marley Mercer stepped into the public eye only when necessary. She visited the sheriff department regularly, asking for updates without raising her voice or showing anger. Her concern was steady and focused. She urged investigators not to give up, reminding them that Calvin never left responsibilities unfinished and never disappeared without explanation. Her presence added emotional weight to the case, but she refused to make dramatic statements. She wanted facts, progress, and a clear direction. Community groups organized volunteer searches during the first week. Dozens of residents walked through fields, wooded areas, and back roads surrounding the station. They carried flashlights, marked grids, and stayed coordinated under the guidance of deputies. People who barely knew Calvin joined the effort, driven by the fear that if someone like him could disappear, anyone could. The search parties worked from morning until late afternoon, covering wide stretches of land. Despite the strong turnout, the efforts produced nothing. No clothing. No personal items. No disturbance in the grass or soil. The search dogs detected no trail leading away from the gas station. Each area checked by volunteers remained unchanged, as if Calvin had never passed through it at all. The absence of evidence became more unsettling than the threat of finding something disturbing. By the fourth day, volunteers had exhausted every reasonable stretch of land. As they gathered at the edge of a field to end the final search, the silence among them reflected a shared realization. Whatever happened to Calvin did not leave a trace that ordinary eyes could see, deepening the mystery at the center of the investigation. The first false lead reached the sheriff department only 2 days after the volunteer searches ended. A caller claimed to have seen a man who looked like Calvin in the passenger seat of a dark pickup truck traveling south toward the interstate. Detectives Edward Halle and Maria Linton followed the report immediately, reviewing traffic cameras and questioning drivers who were on the road that morning. The cameras showed several trucks matching the description, but none contained Calvin. The sighting, once filled with potential, dissolved into uncertainty. The caller later admitted he was not completely sure of what he saw. Soon after, another lead surfaced involving a traveler who checked into a small roadside motel the night before Calvin disappeared. Staff members described him as nervous and restless. When detectives attempted to locate him for questioning, they learned he had left town abruptly, abandoning a personal item in his room. This raised suspicion, and Halle and Linton checked his background for violent history or outstanding warrants. Nothing significant appeared. When they finally identified him, he explained his sudden departure as a reaction to a family emergency in another state. His story was supported by phone records and hospital documents. His connection to the case collapsed, leaving detectives with nothing more than assumptions. As pressure grew, rumors began to circulate throughout the community. One of the most persistent involved illegal trafficking of stolen goods moving quietly through rural gas stations. Some residents suggested that Calvin may have witnessed something he should not have seen. Others speculated that a passing group of thieves targeted the station by chance. Detectives pursued these claims carefully, interviewing individuals known for involvement in minor theft operations. They also reviewed police reports from surrounding counties, looking for similar patterns or suspicious activity near fuel stations. Nothing connected to Calvin's disappearance. The rumor, although dramatic, lacked any factual foundation. Another false lead emerged when a man from a nearby town reported hearing unusual noises behind an abandoned barn late at night. Deputies accompanied him to the location, searching the structure and surrounding land. The noise turned out to be a pair of stray animals nesting under loose boards. No evidence suggested any link to Calvin or the gas station incident. It became another entry in a growing list of dead ends. The investigation slowed as the weeks passed. Halle and Linton reviewed every statement, re-examined every piece of evidence, and revisited the gas station multiple times. Each attempt to spark new momentum ended with the same result: no clear direction. The partial fingerprint lifted from the counter still belonged to no one in the local system, and forensic analysis offered no new breakthroughs. In late November, a new suspect emerged when an out-of-state department alerted the detectives about a drifter involved in petty crimes who had passed through Illinois around the time of Calvin's disappearance. His background suggested instability, and his travel pattern matched movements near the gas station. Halle and Linton located him in a neighboring county and questioned him extensively. His demeanor was evasive, and his story contained inconsistencies. For a moment, it felt like the first real turning point in weeks, but the hope faded quickly. Investigators verified his location on the night of October 12th through multiple witnesses at a shelter several towns away. His alibi was solid. Despite his suspicious behavior, he had no connection to Calvin or the gas station. When the detectives left the interview room, they understood the weight of what they faced. Their last promising suspect had been cleared completely, leaving them again with no suspect, no direction, and no clear explanation for what happened that night. The Mercer disappearance officially entered cold case status in the spring of 2016, nearly 4 years after the initial investigation began. By then, most active leads had been exhausted, and the sheriff department had shifted resources toward newer cases with clearer trajectories. Detectives Edward Halle and Maria Linton, once central to the search, were reassigned to other units. Halle retired later that year, and Linton transferred to a regional task force the following spring. Their departure left Calvin's case without its original advocates, and the remaining staff, already stretched thin, reviewed it only when compelled by administrative schedule inside the evidence storage facility. The materials from the Mercer file occupied 2 medium-sized boxes. The contents included printed phone logs, witness statements, the partial fingerprint card, and photographs of the gas station interior taken the night Calvin vanished. Over time, the boxes were moved from an accessible shelf to a deeper row in the archive, placed among dozens of unresolved cases from a 20-year span. The cardboard edges softened, labels faded slightly, and the case number, once familiar to every officer in the department, became another sequence in a long inventory. The digital components of the investigation aged as well. The original surveillance footage, already grainy in 2012, was stored on a hard drive that eventually became incompatible with newer systems. Audio recordings of interviews sat on outdated formats, requiring special equipment to access. Requests to update or transcribe these materials were logged but rarely acted upon due to limited staffing and budget constraints. As the years passed, the case's accessibility diminished, further reducing the likelihood of spontaneous re-examination. Community attention also waned. Early anniversaries of Calvin's disappearance drew modest gatherings, but attendance fell steadily. By the 6th year, only a few people, mostly long-time residents, paused to acknowledge the date. Newer residents often had no knowledge of the case at all. The gas station itself underwent changes, new ownership, updated signage, and eventual installation of modern security cameras. To many, the location no longer evoked the same sense of loss it once had. Marlene Mercer, however, continued to check with the sheriff department annually. She called each October, sometimes speaking to staff who were unfamiliar with her brother's case until they pulled up the file. Her questions remained consistent. Had there been any new information? Any new forensic approaches? Any unidentified remains matched to Calvin? Each year, the answers remained the same: no updates, no developments, no breakthroughs. Her persistence was noted in the file, though it produced no concrete progress. By 2017, the case had not been formally touched in over a year. Internal audits listed it as inactive but eligible for re-evaluation pending technological advancements. Still, no review occurred. Other investigations, fresh, urgent, and resource-heavy, continued to push the Mercer file further into administrative obscurity. The coldness of the case became both procedural and symbolic. Evidence sat unchanged. Reports remained unreviewed. The partial fingerprint, once a point of hope, lay in its envelope without new comparisons. The silence surrounding the investigation grew heavier with each passing year. Then, in early 2018, a statewide evidence digitization initiative began sweeping through county archives. Its purpose was simple: catalog old materials, convert them to modern formats, and flag cases that might benefit from updated forensic methods. When the Mercer file was scanned into the new system, an automated review flagged it for potential re-examination, an unexpected prompt after years of inactivity. The forensic shift began quietly in the spring of 2019, when the state laboratory completed its transition to new touch DNA extraction equipment. Dozens of dormant cases were pulled for reassessment, including the Mercer disappearance. The file arrived at the lab with minimal expectations. Most analysts believed the age of the samples would limit any meaningful recovery. Still, protocol required a full review, and the technicians prepared the evidence with the steady, methodical approach reserved for long cold material. The first item selected was the partial fingerprint recovered from the counter 17 years earlier. In 2012, the print had been considered too incomplete for reliable matching. Ridge detail existed, but the technology of the time could not reconstruct the missing segments or account for smudging. In 2019, however, updated software offered predictive reconstruction, allowing analysts to regenerate faint sections through enhanced contrast mapping. When the print was scanned into the new system, the software produced a clearer composite than any previous attempt. The result was still partial, but now sufficiently structured for national comparison. Next came the receipt roll found on the floor of the station. The roll had always been considered an odd detail. It showed no sign of forced tearing, no obvious struggle, and no clear fingerprints. Earlier examinations detected only faint biological traces, too minimal to classify. The new touch DNA process, designed to interpret microscopic contact samples, offered a renewed opportunity. Technicians swabbed the edges, the cardboard core, and the outermost layer. The collected material was transferred into a hypersensitive, sequencing device capable of reading tiny fragments previously considered unusable. For weeks, results trickled in. Minor contaminants appeared first: anonymous customer traces, environmental degradation, and unidentifiable debris from decades of storage. Then the machine identified a faint but viable DNA profile, consistent across multiple swabs. It was male. It was not Calvin's, and it did not match any print taken from employees or regular customers interviewed during the original investigation. The analysts prepared the combined profile for submission to the National Forensic Database. The fingerprint reconstruction was uploaded first. The system processed it in seconds, searching millions of entries. No match emerged. The result was noted, but not surprising. Partial prints often failed to connect. The DNA profile followed. It entered the server, passed through the first verification stage, and then moved into the deeper biometric comparison grid. The screen flickered once, then displayed a notification. Candidate match identified. The name was unfamiliar to every investigator who later reviewed the report. Leonard Pike, born 1968, minor theft charges in Texas and New Mexico. No violent offenses. No record of convictions in Illinois. The forensic team examined the accompanying file. Pike's DNA had been collected in 2017 after a misdemeanor arrest in Oklahoma, where a state law required sampling for all repeat offenders. The DNA entry was recent, which explained why earlier comparisons had yielded nothing. The discovery reached the county sheriff department within hours. Detectives assigned to cold cases gathered in a small conference room as the new information was read aloud. The match was not definitive proof of guilt, but it represented the first real break since 2012. The possibility that Pike had touched the receipt roll during the incident opened a new investigative path. His known history as a drifter aligned with the timeline of Calvin's disappearance. Records showed he had traveled through the Midwest repeatedly in the early 1990s, often working short manual labor jobs before moving on. The next step focused on reconstructing Pike's movements. Old employment logs, motel receipts, and transportation records were requested from multiple states. Some documents no longer existed, but scattered fragments confirmed that Pike passed through Illinois during the month Calvin vanished. A motel ledger from a neighboring county listed his name on October 9, 1994, 3 days before the incident. A bus ticket stub from an interstate line placed him heading west 2 days after Calvin disappeared. Detectives cross-referenced these details with archived witness statements. One witness had mentioned a man lingering near the pumps days before the disappearance, though the description at the time had been vague. Another recalled a traveler purchasing a road map late at night but had never been able to identify him. Neither account could be definitively linked to Pike, yet the possibility reinforced the need to trace him further. Investigators contacted federal agencies to determine whether Pike had remained a transient or established a permanent residence. The trail was difficult to follow. Pike used temporary addresses, low-wage jobs, and sporadic identifiers. Several states had no record of him after the early 2000s. Searches continued through DMV files, tax documents. An outdated mailing list. Progress finally arrived when a regional database update connected an alias to one of Pike's past entries. The alias led to a new address registered in Missouri. Detectives paused when they saw the final detail. Leonard Pike was now living under a different name. Detective Sarah Kinley first opened the Mercer case file in early 2019, sitting at a cluttered desk in the cold case unit. The file was thick with faded paperwork, photographs, and reports from decades of investigation. She spread the contents across the table, methodically scanning each document. Detective Jonah Reed joined her a few days later, bringing experience in digital evidence recovery and historical tracking of transient offenders. Both understood that the case was not just about what had been missed, but what modern tools and renewed focus could uncover. They began by reconstructing the timeline of October 12, 1994, moment by moment. Kinley cross-referenced witness statements with the security tape, noting every action Calvin Mercer had taken in the hours leading up to his disappearance. Reed focused on external data, gas station logs, nearby motels, road maps, and local transit schedules. Each detail was verified, cataloged, and compared with Leonard Pike's known travel patterns from archived records. Their work created a detailed picture that had never fully existed in 1994. The detectives divided responsibilities carefully. Kinley reviewed the physical evidence from the lab reanalysis, studying fingerprints, the receipt roll, and photographs of the scene. She traced the partial prints, noting angles, lengths, and positions relative to the counter. Every detail, from the smudges on the receipt roll to the positioning of cigarette cartons, was documented and cross-checked with the new forensic reports. Reed concentrated on Pike's historical movements, using bus records, employment logs, and arrest files from multiple states. He created a map that charted Pike's known locations in Illinois. During the early 1990s, they also re-examined the early investigative efforts, identifying gaps caused by the limitations of technology at the time. Grainy video from the station was enhanced using modern software. Timelines were rebuilt with precision, highlighting inconsistencies in witness recollections and unverified statements. Each new analysis reinforced the detectives' understanding of how close the original investigation had come without making connections. In addition to evidence reconstruction, Kinley and Reed consulted colleagues from neighboring counties and federal agencies. They requested archived files on transient workers and repeat offenders who had traveled through Illinois. Old arrest records were re-entered into searchable databases. They cross-referenced these files with witness statements and motel registrations, looking for overlaps or patterns. Each connection added clarity, each dead end refined the focus. Over several weeks, a clearer pattern emerged. Pike's movements during October 1994 were consistent with temporary labor in towns surrounding the gas station. Payroll logs, employment receipts, and local tax records confirmed that he had worked odd jobs in the vicinity in the days immediately before and after Calvin Mercer's disappearance. He had been in the region long enough to know the area, yet his transient lifestyle allowed him to disappear quickly. The detectives noted the significance of this detail. Pike's presence near the station at the critical time frame shifted him from a distant suspect to someone who could plausibly have committed the crime. Every prior lead was reinterpreted in light of this new understanding. Previous gaps in the investigation now appeared as lost opportunities, and the detectives recognized the importance of pursuing this connection carefully and systematically. By combining modern investigative methods with historical data, Kinley and Reed were finally able to connect the evidence to Pike's presence in the region. The meticulous reconstruction of his movements exposed what the original investigation could not. Leonard Pike had worked in the area immediately before and after Calvin Mercer vanished, placing him near the gas station during the week of the disappearance. Leonard Pike was arrested quietly at his Missouri residence in late 2019. Detectives Sarah Kinley and Jonah Reed coordinated with local authorities to avoid any disruption or potential flight. Pike was cooperative at first, answering standard questions with vague, guarded responses. DNA confirmation had already linked him to the partial print and the touch DNA found on the receipt roll from the Mercer gas station. The evidence was clear, but Pike's demeanor suggested he understood the weight of what was coming. He had lived decades without facing this chapter of his life. Being brought to light, the questioning began in a controlled environment at the county sheriff's office. Detectives presented him with the forensic findings, emphasizing the DNA link, his confirmed presence in Illinois at the time, and his documented transient work near the gas station. Pike maintained a composed exterior initially, but the investigators' methodical presentation of the timeline and concrete evidence began to wear down his resolve. Each fact contradicted the narrative he had likely rehearsed for years. Hours passed as detectives reconstructed the events of October 12, 1994. Pike was shown security camera frames, receipts, and fingerprint analysis results. Investigators detailed the precise movements of Calvin Mercer during the night of his disappearance, emphasizing the moments captured on tape and the location of items found at the scene. Each element was presented calmly, with precision, leaving no space for evasion. Pike's responses grew shorter and less certain. His attention increasingly focused on the mounting evidence Kinley and Reed described, the forensic advances that had made the breakthrough possible, particularly the touch DNA analysis and reconstruction of the partial print. Pike could see that the technology left no ambiguity, and his composed posture began to falter. He shifted in his seat, avoided eye contact, and occasionally stared at the floor, reflecting the slow realization that denial was no longer sustainable. Eventually, Pike admitted that he had been at the gas station on the night of Calvin Mercer's disappearance. He explained that his original intent had been theft small items, cash, and cigarettes. He claimed he never planned violence, but he panicked when Calvin confronted him. The escalation had been instantaneous. He had forced Mercer into his car, unable to release him without risking his own capture. Pike described acting alone, asserting that no one else had been involved in the crime. The detectives pressed further, reviewing the location of Calvin's disappearance and the pattern of evidence left behind. Pike acknowledged disposing of the body in a remote wooded area, providing general details but avoiding exact coordinates initially. He admitted to covering his tracks carefully, leaving minimal trace for investigators to follow, and described how the decades of movement and transient living had allowed him to escape detection for so long. His tone remained measured, but the weight of confession was unmistakable. Investigators documented each statement meticulously, noting contradictions and clarifications. Pike's admissions aligned with the forensic evidence and the reconstructed timeline. There was no indication of embellishment. His confession completed the bridge between decades-old uncertainty and the tangible. Evidence now in investigators' possession. By the end of the extended session, Pike's collapse under the pressure of undeniable facts became evident. The pattern of methodical questioning and clear presentation of DNA evidence had overcome decades of evasion. He paused before providing one final piece of information: the precise area where he had disposed of Calvin Mercer's body. After consultation with the detectives, Pike agreed to lead authorities to the location, setting the stage for the recovery and verification that would confirm the truth of his confession. Authorities arrived at the remote woodland site shortly after Leonard Pike agreed to lead them. The area was dense, covered with underbrush and fallen leaves, and showed signs of minimal human disturbance over the years. Forensic teams methodically marked grids and used specialized equipment to ensure nothing was overlooked. Each step was deliberate, every movement recorded for evidence. Pike walked ahead, pointing out landmarks as he described where he had left the body nearly 25 years earlier. Excavation began with careful scraping of soil layers. Within hours, human remains were located, partially concealed under a natural mound of dirt and debris. Investigators noted the location, position, and state of the remains, photographing every detail before collection. Forensic specialists worked to preserve the integrity of the bones, preparing them for transportation to the state lab for identification. Evidence bags and tagged containers ensured the chain of custody remained unbroken. Critical for a case that had already spanned decades, the lab analysis was meticulous. Forensic anthropologists and DNA experts collaborated, comparing tissue and bone samples with Calvin Mercer's dental records and the original DNA reference taken from his family. The results confirmed the identity without ambiguity. Calvin Mercer had been located. The discovery brought the long-cold case full circle, providing the final piece of evidence that aligned with Pike's confession. Once the recovery was complete, detectives returned to the sheriff's office to begin coordinating the next steps. Arrest documentation was finalized, ensuring Pike's admission was properly recorded and could withstand scrutiny in court. Charges were updated to include homicide, kidnapping, and evidence tampering. His previous minor offenses were noted for context but did not impact the formal proceedings related to Mercer's case. News of the breakthrough spread quickly through the small Illinois community. The town, which had grown accustomed to the unsettling mystery of Calvin's disappearance, responded with disbelief. Residents who had once spoken in hushed tones about the night of October 12, 1994, now grappled with the reality that the case had been resolved after nearly 25 years. Local newspapers and media outlets covered the arrest and recovery with factual reports, emphasizing the sequence of evidence, forensic breakthroughs, and the diligence of the new investigative team. Marlene Mercer received the confirmation in person from Detective Sarah Kinley. She listened quietly as the facts were presented, absorbing decades of uncertainty in a single moment. There were no dramatic expressions of grief or relief in public statements, only a calm acknowledgement that the truth had finally emerged. For the first time, she had a definitive answer about what had happened to her brother. The details corroborated by forensic analysis and Pike's confession, law enforcement, and community leaders emphasized the importance of persistence and modern investigative techniques. They noted how decades-old evidence, once considered unusable, had become central to solving the case. The narrative of Calvin Mercer's disappearance was rewritten, moving from uncertainty and fear to resolution. However late, while the community absorbed the news, detectives continued reviewing Pike's history. Court documents, background checks, and interstate records revealed that Pike had been investigated in 2 other states during the years following the crime. These details, though unrelated to Mercer's case, suggested a pattern of transient behavior and minor criminal activity. Adding context to how he had remained undetected for so long, the Mercer case closed in 2019, 25 years after Calvin Mercer vanished from his night shift at the small Illinois gas station. The resolution came quietly, driven by a combination of persistent investigation, advances in forensic technology, and careful re-examination of long-dormant evidence. What had once been a file gathering dust on a shelf became a solved case, a reminder of how time, diligence, and innovation could intersect to bring clarity to events that once seemed unsolvable. Forensic technology had evolved dramatically since 1994. What was once a partial fingerprint, smudged and considered unusable, became a key link when enhanced. Reconstruction and database comparison finally identified Leonard Pike touch DNA extraction from objects that had been stored. For decades revealed traces imperceptible to earlier methods. These techniques transformed the investigation, providing evidence that was indisputable and compelling. It highlighted how cold case units, with access to modern tools, could uncover truths long buried beneath the weight of time. The case also underscored the role of methodical persistence. Early investigators, limited by available technology and resources, had pursued every lead they could identify. They had interviewed witnesses, canvassed neighborhoods, followed false leads, and documented every detail meticulously. Their work laid the foundation for the breakthrough years later. Without the careful preservation of evidence, the fingerprint, the receipt roll, and the security footage might never have been re-examined. It was a quiet reminder that even unresolved cases demand thorough documentation and patience. For the community, the resolution brought a restrained sense of closure. Residents who had lived with uncertainty for decades were reminded of the fragility of safety in a quiet town. Calvin Mercer's disappearance had left a gap in daily routines, conversations, and the collective memory of the area. While the truth provided factual answers, it could not erase the lingering sense of unease that had followed the community for so many years. For family, the impact was equally measured. Marlene Mercer, who had checked for updates year after year, received confirmation of her brother's fate. The forensic evidence, combined with Pike's confession, allowed her to understand the sequence of events and reconcile decades of unanswered questions. It was a form of closure grounded in fact rather than speculation. Minimal in emotion but profound in its significance, the Mercer case now serves as an example of how cold cases, once considered hopeless, can be resolved through a combination of forensic innovation, meticulous investigation, and renewed focus. It highlights both the limitations and potential of law enforcement, illustrating how time can both obscure and reveal. As the file was finally closed, investigators noted that the evidence room still held numerous other unsolved cases from the same era. Some lacked witnesses, others lacked DNA, and several had been considered dormant for decades. While the Mercer case ended definitively, the broader landscape of unresolved investigations remained. Each file represented questions still unanswered, lives still affected, and mysteries waiting for the same persistence, patience, and technological breakthroughs that had finally brought Calvin Mercer's story to a conclusion.